1.5, bias in sampling. So in 1.4, we talked about the different ways to get a sample to try and make our sample as accurate as possible. And so now we're going to talk about some issues with sampling. We did good work. We set up a good sample. What are some ways that even if we intended to get a good sample, what are some ways that that could go wrong? So we're going to talk about 3 different types of bias and kind of explain how and what we can do to kind of counteract those. The first one is sampling bias. And this is a fairly easy one to overcome. This is simply when you're going from your population to create your sample, you have excluded a significant portion of that population. So the example here is you're wanting to get information about all of men, but you only choose men on the East Coast. So no matter how you set that up, or maybe you did random sampling, you just happen to end up with a sample that didn't really span the entire spectrum of men. The issue that this can create is something called undercoverage. Undercoverage is an issue that's created by sampling bias. It leads to a lack of representation. So if we go back to our example of Arapahoe High School as our population, and we are trying to ask about if sophomores should be allowed parking passes, so sophomores can start parking at Arapahoe High School. So we want to ask all of the people that could be affected by that. And so we create a random sample, but our random sample happens to only contain juniors and seniors. Well, that's going to create an issue because sophomores are greatly impacted by this supposed rule change, and they're impacted in such a way that their opinion will probably or could differ from the people that we actually got. So there's an undercoverage, an underrepresentation of sophomores whose voices should be heard in this proposed rule change. So that's the type of issue, and creating a good sample gets rid of that undercoverage issue. Making sure you do something like stratified sampling so you have an accurate representation of sophomores, juniors, and seniors. All of that can help eliminate sampling bias. The next 2 are significantly harder and almost impossible to get rid of entirely, but there are some ways, and we'll talk about some ways that researchers try and combat these issues. The first one is called the non-response bias. And what happens with a non-response bias is just like the name entails, it means people that you have selected to be in your survey choose not to respond. And therefore you get a non-response. And for whatever reason, if a large percent or a scientifically significant, we'll talk about that later on, what that term means. But if we have a significant or a meaningful percentage of people that don't fill out the survey or choose not to respond to a certain question in the survey, that's when we get a non-response bias. And that non-response bias is tricky because we don't know what it is. Maybe the reason those people are choosing to ignore the question is because of the way the question was worded, or they have some common theme, common feeling that they don't want to express. And because all of the people not answering feel the same way, we're getting bad data back because we don't have those voices in our survey. If we go back to the census, where the government is trying to get information about everyone that's in America, you get a non-response bias from people who aren't willing to fill out that survey. So maybe unintentionally, you get a non-response bias based on people that don't have a home. And so, or that are a more transient lifestyle, so they don't have a permanent mailing address, so that census can't catch up with them. And maybe a significant portion of those people that don't have that kind of stable home would answer the survey in a certain way, leading to something that impacts them more helpfully. But if they can't answer it, then you're getting a non-response bias. Um, it's one of those, if you've heard the phrase, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's kind of the opposite of a non-response bias, meaning we can only know if there's a problem if someone speaks up and talks about it. So if the people that aren't responding have a different opinion or a different voice or want to say something, but they don't actually make that opinion known, then there's nothing that the researchers can do about that. And so that is what non-response bias is. Um, and it's really hard to combat that. There are a few ways of um, trying to combat that, and one of the ways is getting like paying people, giving some incentive to fill out that survey. Um, while the census, the incentive to complete the census is it's illegal if you don't, and you can go to jail for it and you can get fines for it. For most other surveys, um, it's not illegal not to serve them or to fill them out. And so what companies can do is they'll pay you. It benefits them to have their sample fill out the information. And so they're willing to reward you for filling out that information. When I was in college, and it's now even a more expansive type of thing, but marketing companies need market tests to see how well different products are going to do when they get released to market. And so you can go online, you fill out information, you enter all of your kind of demographic information, age, gender, education level, where you live, all this type of information about yourself. And then when companies are trying to release a new product or trying to get market information, meaning information about who they're going to advertise to, they go to these marketing companies and say, hey, we've got a new product. We want to find out how well this new Mountain Dew flavor or chip flavor is going to do with high school to college age people. Can you do some test marketing for us? And when that happens, this marketing company has to go around and they have to create a sample of people that fall into that company's range. So high school to college. And if you filled out all your information and you're in that demographic that they're trying to advertise to, that marketing company can call you up and say, hey, you fit into one of our tests. Will you come out and do a taste test for us? And they'll say it's going to cost, or it's going to take 3 hours, so you'll have to be here for 3 hours, but we'll pay you $100 or we'll pay you $50 for your time and effort. Come out here. And then when you go there, maybe it's a soda, so you drink 2 or 3 different sodas, and then you fill out a survey that asks all sorts of questions about that soda. Did you like the color? Did you like the flavor? Did you like the taste? What were your first impressions of it? What was the smell like? All sorts of information from people that they're going to try and sell this new product to. And so in order to make sure that they get a good sample and they get good data, companies are willing to pay you for that information. Sometimes even if you do that, you don't get necessarily good responses. There's been some really interesting marketing campaigns that have gone horribly awry, but they did all of that kind of research. So one of them, Colorado, back in the 90s, I believe it was one of the test markets for a new Pepsi product called Crystal Pepsi. And kind of the gimmick of Crystal Pepsi was it was clear. It looked like 7-Up or Sprite or almost like water. They just didn't put any of that kind of caramel coloring in it. And so it tasted just like Pepsi, but it was clear. And so the idea of that was in the 90s, if something looked clear, it was thought to be more healthy. And so this was almost like a healthy alternative to a regular Pepsi. It was clear, so it had to have less bad stuff in it. And it was released, I don't believe it was released nationwide, but it was released within the Denver metro area for a couple months, and then it eventually went away. Some other things that went through all the tests, and that's an example of a test market or doing a survey, You put things out, and companies that have lots of money, that's kind of that final stage before releasing it worldwide or nationwide. They're going to put that product in a couple different markets across the country and see how it fares. So, how many people buy it? Does it increase sales? Does it decrease sales? Do people come back and buy it? And that's kind of like the last way to get some tested data is put it into markets, actually sell it and see what happens. And if it does well, then they can release it nationwide. If it does not do well, they can pull it from the markets, and they haven't spent time distributing it to the entire country or the entire world, which costs even more money. So that's kind of that last step. Another one that was kind of a failed market is I believe it was called Coke AM or AM Coke, something like that. It was essentially marketed as soda that you drink in the morning instead of your coffee. That was a horrible idea and went very, it did not, no one that was drinking coffee decided to buy AM Coke instead of drink coffee. And people that drank Coke in the morning instead of coffee just wanted regular Coke in the first place. They didn't need a new beverage. So that's kind of how some of this marketing works and why you need a good sample. If your sample says, oh, this is going to be amazing, and then it's not a good sample, you can get bad data and make poor choices based on that data. Another example of a poor product, which I have to imagine came from some poor sampling. So the people that were asked if this was a good idea or not were not the correct people, were not the people that they should have been asking. And this was a new type of potato chip. And it was a potato chip designed specifically for women. It was called like Ladies Doritos or Doritos for Women, something like that. But it was a chip designed and targeted for the female audience. And the difference between a regular chip, a regular Doritos or Lay's chip, and this new product that was designed specifically for women was after they'd done market research, the chip maker, I can't remember if it's Doritos or Fritos. I think it was Doritos, so I'll go with that, but I could be mistaken. The company found out that women don't like eating chips because they don't like the noise it creates. That was what their research came up with. They don't like eating chips because chips are too loud. Women like to be discreet and modest, and they don't want to sit on a bus or a train or in a classroom and eat a chip because it's going to make a lot of noise, and then people will look at them. That was what their research came up with. And so they created a chip that was quieter to eat. They created packaging that wouldn't crinkle and wasn't quite so loud when it got moved around. And they released this into test markets again, not nationwide, not worldwide, but in a certain test markets to see how it would fare. And there was a massive backlash against that company because people felt like essentially it was saying women need to be quiet. Women can't eat the same chips as men, or girls can't eat the same chips as boys because women need to be quieter when they're eating chips. And that did not go well for that company. So they pulled that from the markets and they wrote an apology letter saying that was not the intent and a bunch of stuff like that. But that is what can happen if your surveys, your test markets, the people you ask to gather information, if you don't pick a good sample, that is some of the issues that can arise from not having a good sample. You get bad data back, and then if you move forward based off that bad data, you can reach some pretty poor decisions and pretty poor choices. So that is a non-response bias. The last one we're going to talk about is a response bias, and that's where people don't tell the truth when they answer you. There's a couple different ways of response bias kind of occurring. One of them is a flat out lie, and one of them is kind of more of an exaggeration. Still a lie, but not intending to be untruthful, but kind of trying to give the answer that you want to hear. And so we have some examples of what you can do or types of response bias. Um, Interviewer error. So if you're going to give a person-to-person, a one-on-one kind of interview questionnaire, as a researcher, it's your job to make sure that the interviewer is going to be able to get good data from the interviewee. The person asking the questions has to be able to build a rapport and a trust with the people that you are bringing in to answer questions. If the Herald, Arapahoe's magazine or newspaper, is trying to do a study or a paper on the amount of students that use drugs or alcohol, and they send out a questionnaire or something that says, hey, if you're willing to answer questions, fill this out, and then we'll call you in and we'll interview you and we'll ask you some questions. We promise it will be confidential. We won't tell anyone who interviewed and what they answered. So student A says, okay, I'm willing to talk about my drug and alcohol use. I'll answer truthfully. So they say, yep, awesome. I'll answer your questions. They go in, and it turns out the person that's going to ask them those questions is one of our SROs. Do you think that SRO is going to be able to build that trust with a high school student that is asking them, hey, have you used drugs or alcohol, which are both illegal, and so they could get in trouble by their SRO? It's going to be really hard to build that trust. So if you're going to ask those questions, you need to make sure that it's a peer and not a person of authority. You need to make sure it's one of the students that is running the newspaper and not an SRO or not a teacher or not a person that could get the student in trouble. So it's up to the interviewer to make sure that they can build that trust. And as a researcher, the person that's kind of putting this together, you need to make sure you're picking out interviewers that can get that trust, build that trust with different people. So you need to think about gender, ethnicity, where they come from, and it depends on the types of questions you're asking. If you're going to be asking political questions, you need to make sure that you're picking an interviewer that can come off as unbiased or not kind of ruffle those feathers. If you're going to be asking Republicans questions, you want to make sure that that Republican isn't going to come in and feel like it is a Democrat that is judging them about their answers. And likewise, if it's a Democrat, you don't want the interviewer to come off as a Republican, because that can create animosity and tense stress in that interview, and that can lead to response bias. So that's one of the things that you have to be careful of. And there's some ways of kind of getting around this response bias. And I think this is one of the really cool things and one of the powerful things you can do with statistics. When you're asking questions, sociologists have seen this a lot. Psychologists have seen this and use the same strategies, because they use statistics and statisticians a lot to conduct their research. And it's something called kind of A/B testing. And so essentially in an A/B test, you have two different forms. You have form A and form B, and you give out those two forms to people. And in form A and form B, you flipped the order of answers. So maybe on form A is true and B is false for all your questions. On the B form, A is false and B is true. So you flipped the order of true and false. And the idea behind that is it's been shown that if you're answering a significant number of questions, eventually our mind gets bored. And if we don't have a high connection to a question, we will just fill in the first bubble. So without even reading a question, people are more likely to answer A than they are B. And if every form you give out or every survey you give out, A is true, you're going to have a lot more truths simply because people are bored and just fill in the first bubble. So with this A/B type testing, you'll get a bunch of people who fill in A, which is true, but you'll also get a bunch of people that just fill in A, which is false, from the other version of that survey. And the idea is that those two versions will kind of offset each other. And so it's important to make sure you're changing those questions with the knowledge that people will just pick the first multiple choice answer to bubble something in. So you kind of have to change that around to make sure you spread that first question or first option to all of the different possibilities. Another one is a order of question. Again, in sociology, if you've taken that, or psychology, you've taken that, there's a thing called priming. And what that is it's when someone says something, your brain registers it. And even without you knowing, that can impact your opinions and the way you're thinking later on. So if we're going through and we have a bunch of questions, and the first question I ask is, hey, do you like going to see Broncos games? So like, yes or no. But I've primed you with thinking about football, Broncos, going to sporting events. If later on in this questionnaire I ask, hey, what do you like to do in your free time? Because that question I asked earlier that talked about the Broncos, football, sports, going to sporting events, that is going to cause more people to write down going to football, watching the Broncos, that type of thing for that second question. So it's important to consider and think about how the priming effect is going to change these answers and change the order of those questions. So maybe instead of talking about the Broncos first, you ask the, hey, what do you like doing in your free time first? Then later on in the survey, you can ask, do you ever enjoy going to a Broncos game in your free time? But you've already asked what they like to do, so that's not going to impact that question later on. So the order of your questions can be much more important than people typically think because of that priming effect. That priming effect can have a huge impact on answers, the way people think. If you ever read a book about negotiations or how to negotiate and things like that, that priming, or it's also called anchoring, is incredibly impactful. So if you ever start negotiating about buying a car or buying a house, anchoring is going to be like the first number that's given out. So if you see a house that's listed for sale and the list price of that house is $500,000, that's an anchoring point. Your mind has already thought, okay, well, they think this house is worth $500,000. So if I offer $300,000, that's so far away from their 500,000. Like, I'm not going to offer that. That's so much less. And so that's the idea. You have to be careful and thoughtful about how you ask questions, the order in which you ask questions. Also, the last type is open response and closed response. Open response is a free response question. You can get much better data from that because they can write whatever they want, but it's also much harder to collect that data. If I send out an open response survey, so a fill in the blank survey to 1,000 people, I have to be able to have the manpower to read all 100 or 1,000 surveys and kind of write down what they wrote. I have to be able to read their writing, all of that information, which can be incredibly difficult and time consuming. However, if you give a multiple choice survey, you don't have to read any of it. You can send it through a Scantron machine and collect that data almost instantly. However, the responses are limited. You ask maybe 4 multiple choice questions, or maybe there's 6 options. You have a very limited answer choice. So typically what is done, if you don't already know kind of what answers you want to put on there, is you'll give a smaller version of that survey that is open response. So you give out maybe 100 open response surveys. you collect those 100 and you find the 4 or 5 most common answers to all your questions. Then you make those 4 or 5 answers the closed response answers. And then once you have those, like, okay, these are the 4 most common, you're given a survey about what's trendy. And so you have the 4 most popular brands of clothing. Now you can send out a survey to 100,000 people. And instead of saying, what's your favorite clothing company? You can say, select your favorite clothing company and just give those 4 responses. And then once you collect all 100,000, now you can analyze that data much faster because you don't have to go through and read each one individually. Now, like with all statistics, this can be used in a very kind of sneaky way by different companies. One of those ways is by kind of limiting your options and kind of skewing you towards an answer that the company is looking for. So there was a survey done back kind of when I was ending high school, beginning college, so late 90s, early 2000s, where it came out and said like 95% of college students think Levi 504 jeans are cool or hip or whatever the word was. But if you looked at the survey that was released, the reason that so many people responded that Levi's 504 jeans were hip or cool or in style or whatever was because that was the only option for jeans. In the survey, they had like, are jeans cool for guys? And they gave out like, oh, I like, or what kind of clothing is in for guys? And they had like cargo pants and corduroys because corduroy pants were popular when I was in high school and this and that. And then instead of just saying jeans, they said Levi's 504s. So if people thought any type of jeans were cool, the only way they could respond to that was by selecting the Levi's brand. And then Levi's got to say, hey, look at this. We did data collection. We did a survey. And it turns out that 95% of college kids think Levi 504s are super cool. You should buy some too. And so they didn't necessarily do anything illegal, but what they did was definitely sneaky, and they knew what answer they were trying to get and set up the survey to make sure they got that data. So when you're doing research or when you're looking at research that has been done, it's very important to look at that research critically. Don't necessarily take it at face value. If you think it's too good to be true or you don't think it's true, look at it, do that research. And this concept that I'm talking about now is why I think statistics is such an important class for everyone to take. In order to be capable of looking at research, looking at a paper, looking at data, and being able to come up with your own conclusions, or at least be able to say, something doesn't look right. I don't know if I believe this study. Because with the internet, there are studies done all over the place, and you can find a study to support almost anything, whether it's good or bad. But if you start and if you're capable of kind of looking deeper into that study, you can get a more complete picture of what that survey is actually telling you. So if you look at a survey that deals with some societal issues, you can find a survey on both sides of any kind of divisive societal issue. Before Colorado legalized marijuana, you were seeing, you guys probably weren't seeing that because it got legalized way before you were probably looking at newspapers and the internet for that type of thing. But that was a big debate topic when I was in college. And so there were surveys and data and charts from both sides saying how awesome it will be to have cannabis and hemp legalized so we can make rope and we can make paper, and hemp oil is amazing and you can make paper out of hemp and it's more sustainable than trees and You can make rope out of it and clothes out of it. And then you saw other things saying people that have used marijuana go on to use other drugs. It's a gateway drug. The increase in marijuana usage also leads to a criminal increase. So more crime is going to happen if you legalize that. And I would like to think that none of these research papers and none of the data collection were intentionally done poorly. I think they were intentionally done to make sure that they produced the answers that they were looking for. They were paid for by a certain company, and the research companies that were being paid wanted to make sure that when they were done, they got the answer that the company that was paying them wanted them to get. And so without doing things illegal, without doing things wrong, you can set up your research, your survey, your questions to lead people in a certain way. And so hopefully after you've taken this course, you're able to dig into research a little bit more and be more confident about, yeah, I realize that this paper says that if you smoke marijuana, you're going to turn into a zombie, but you're going to be smart enough to be able to go back, look at that research and see where did they collect that data from? What was their sample? What questions were asked? And decide for yourself if you actually think that's good data being collected, or if we should ignore that because it turns out the research that was collected was actually only done talking to 7-year-olds, and those 7-year-olds all think that smoking marijuana turns you into a zombie. So that's the importance of statistics, being smart enough to be able to look at information and decide for yourself whether you think that it is valid or not. And just because you decide it's valid or not doesn't make it valid or not, but it gives you a better chance to take a second and not just take something on the headline. Go deeper into it and make sure you're being an intelligent person, an intelligent member of society, and not just looking at headlines and believing everything you read. That's why I think statistics is super important. So on the notes, it goes on to talk about or give examples of misrepresented answers. Here it says, how fast can you run a mile? And you're not exactly sure how fast. It may take me like 10 or 11 minutes. So I may say 10 minutes. Or it could say, hey, what time do you normally show up to work? Well, if I'm supposed to be at work at 8, most likely I'm going to respond to, I show up before 8 o'clock or at the latest 8 o'clock, especially if the person interviewing me is my boss. If Miss Permenko is asking to see what time most of the teachers arrive, most likely she won't get accurate information because teachers shouldn't tell her that they show up at 8:20. We're supposed to be here a half hour before school starts to get ready and be available for students. And so if she asked me, and I'm like, oh yeah, I show up at like 8:32 sometimes. Like I show up 2 minutes late to my actual class. I just make sure someone else unlocks the door and that kids come in and just sit down and hang out for a couple minutes. That's really bad. I'm not going to say that. Even if it's true, it's not true. But even if it was, I wouldn't say that answer because it would get me in trouble. So those are examples of misrepresented answers. It goes through and gives some examples of how you can change the words to make something seem more aggressive or to get people to answer a question in a certain way. So here we have, do you think the United States should forbid public speeches against democracy? And do you think the United States should allow public speeches against democracy? And you can see that those questions are asking the same thing, but the wording is different. The wording in that first one has like a trigger word, a word that is designed to evoke emotion, and that is forbid. Americans have a strong sense of individualism, and we really don't like being told we can't do something. And so when you use words like should the government forbid something, or should you be forbidden from doing this? You're going to get an increase of people saying, no, we shouldn't forbid things. I'm an adult. I should be able to do whatever I want. You can't force me not to do this, or you can't force me to do this. And so those types of words evoke emotion, and they're intended to get people to answer in a certain way. And so this first question is set up to get a certain answer. It is not a neutral question because the word used, forbid, is not a neutral word. The word allow is a neutral word. People should be allowed to do things. People shouldn't be allowed to do things. That's a neutral word. Forbid is not neutral. It evokes an emotional response. And so when you're going through and you're trying to, if you're trying to set up a good survey that's going to get accurate, real results, you want to try as hard as possible to use neutral words and neutral phrasing to get actual answers. When you see emotional words and kind of those trigger words, that's the sign of a bad survey. That is people writing that survey to get a certain answer. They're trying to evoke that response, and they're trying to get people to answer a certain way so that they can use that data to support their side of an argument or to support their side of a bill or a law or whatever the case is. But they're setting it up in a certain way. Then it goes through and talks about how you can order questions or change the words in the question. Like I was talking about in that A/B testing. You have two different forms where you change the wording or you change the answers from true false to false true. Same idea. And then the types of questions, that gives an example of that open-ended and that multiple choice type. All right, that is the end of 1.5. Only one more section to go in chapter 1.